10 MMA fighters who had ties to crime. Number 1. War Machine. When people talk about the darkest stories in MMA history, one name almost always comes up first: War Machine. Born Jonathan Koppenhaver, he wasn't just another fighter trying to make a name for himself. He had charisma, aggression, and a personality that made him stand out immediately. Fighting in promotions like UFC and Bellator MMA, War Machine built a reputation as an explosive, dangerous competitor who could finish fights quickly. But even early in his career, there were warning signs that something wasn't right outside the cage. War Machine's fighting style reflected his personality: unpredictable, violent, and intense. Fans were drawn to him because he felt real, raw, and unfiltered. He didn't try to be a polished athlete. He embraced chaos. But that same chaos would eventually destroy everything he had built. While many fighters struggle with discipline and the pressures of fame, War Machine's issues went far beyond that. His life outside MMA began spiraling into legal trouble, controversies, and increasingly disturbing behavior. Everything came crashing down in 2014 in a case that shocked not just the MMA community, but the entire world. War Machine was accused of committing a brutal assault against his ex-girlfriend, an incident that was both violent and prolonged. The details that emerged were horrifying, painting a picture of a man completely out of control. This wasn't just another athlete getting into trouble. This was something far darker. The story dominated headlines and quickly became one of the most infamous criminal cases involving a professional fighter. After the incident, War Machine fled, triggering a nationwide manhunt that only intensified the media frenzy. For days, authorities searched for him while the public followed every update. When he was finally captured, it marked the beginning of a long and highly publicized legal battle. In court, the evidence and testimonies revealed the full extent of what had happened, and it became clear that this case would have a lasting impact on how people viewed fighters and their lives outside the cage. In 2017, War Machine was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after several decades. It was a definitive end to a career that once showed promise, but was ultimately overshadowed by violence and crime. His story serves as a chilling reminder that talent alone isn't enough to build a legacy. Discipline, control, and the choices made outside the cage matter just as much, if not more, than what happens inside it. For MMA fans, War Machine's story is both fascinating and disturbing. It's the ultimate example of how quickly a fighter's life can collapse when personal demons take over. From a rising name in the sport to one of the most notorious figures in its history, his downfall remains one of the most shocking and tragic stories MMA has ever seen. Number 2. Jon Jones. When it comes to pure talent inside the octagon, very few fighters in history can match Jon Jones. From the moment he entered the UFC, it was clear that he was different: younger, faster, more creative, and more unpredictable than anyone else in the light heavyweight division. Jones quickly rose to the top and became the youngest champion in UFC history. His performances weren't just wins, they were statements. He dominated legends, dismantled contenders, and built a legacy that many consider one of the greatest in MMA history. But outside the cage, Jones's story took a very different path. As his career skyrocketed, so did the controversies surrounding him. What should have been a flawless run at the top was repeatedly interrupted by legal issues and personal mistakes. One of the most infamous incidents came in 2015, when Jones was involved in a hit-and-run accident. According to reports, he fled the scene after crashing into another vehicle, leaving behind not only damage but also serious legal consequences. The situation shocked fans and led to him being stripped of his title, halting his momentum at the peak of his dominance. And that was just the beginning. Jones's career became a cycle of incredible comebacks followed by setbacks. He returned to the octagon multiple times, each time reminding the world why he was so dangerous. His fight IQ, reach, and creativity made him nearly untouchable. Yet, time and time again, issues outside competition overshadowed his achievements. Failed drug tests, suspensions, and run-ins with the law became recurring themes in his story. For a fighter of his caliber, it was frustrating for fans to watch because every time he stepped into the cage, he proved he could be the best in the world. What makes Jon Jones such a compelling figure is this constant contrast. Inside the cage, he's calculated, composed, and almost untouchable. Outside of it, his life has often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Arrests and legal troubles continued to appear at different points in his career, raising questions about discipline, accountability, and the pressures of being at the very top of the sport. Despite everything, Jones has managed to remain relevant and, in many ways, dominant. His move to heavyweight reignited discussions about his greatness, showing that even after years of setbacks, his skill level remains elite. For many fans, he is still the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. For others, his legacy is complicated, brilliant, but flawed. Jon Jones's story isn't just about talent, it's about what happens when greatness is constantly tested by personal choices. It's a reminder that even the most gifted fighters aren't invincible outside the cage. In the end, his legacy will always be a mix of dominance and controversy, making him one of the most fascinating and polarizing figures in MMA history. Number 3. Conor McGregor. Few fighters in MMA history have changed the sport the way Conor McGregor did. When he entered the UFC, he wasn't just another contender, he was a phenomenon. With his sharp tongue, unmatched confidence, and precise striking, McGregor quickly became the biggest star the sport had ever seen. He predicted knockouts, backed up his words with action, and captured titles in 2 weight classes, becoming the first simultaneous double champion in UFC history. Inside the octagon, he was electric. Outside of it, however, his story became increasingly complicated. As McGregor's fame grew, so did the number of controversies surrounding him. One of the most infamous incidents came in 2018 during a media event in New York ahead of UFC 223. In a moment that shocked the entire MMA world, McGregor and a group of associates attacked a bus carrying several fighters. He was seen throwing a metal dolly through the window, shattering glass and injuring people inside. The footage spread instantly across social media, turning what should have been fight promotion into a major legal issue. The incident led to his arrest and marked a turning point in how fans and media viewed him. But that wasn't the only time McGregor made headlines for the wrong reasons. Over the years, there have been multiple reports of altercations, including bar fights and physical confrontations. One widely circulated incident showed McGregor striking an older man in a pub after a disagreement, sparking criticism even from longtime fans. There have also been various legal accusations and investigations that added further controversy to his public image. While not all cases resulted in convictions, they contributed to a growing narrative that McGregor's behavior outside the cage was becoming as unpredictable as his fighting style once was. What makes McGregor such a unique figure is the contrast between his brilliance and his volatility. At his best, he is one of the most skilled and entertaining fighters to ever compete. His knockout of Jose Aldo, his wars with Nate Diaz, and his rise to global superstardom are moments that defined an era of MMA. But alongside those achievements is a pattern of behavior that has repeatedly put his career at risk. For fans, this creates a complicated legacy. Some see him as a once-in-a-generation superstar who revolutionized the sport. Others see a fighter whose potential has been overshadowed by poor decisions outside the octagon. Regardless of perspective, it's impossible to ignore the impact he has had, both positive and negative. Conor McGregor's story is still being written, but it already stands as one of the most dramatic in MMA history. It's a story of fame, power, and the consequences that come with both. Because in the end, being the biggest star in the sport doesn't just bring success. It also brings pressure, scrutiny, and moments that can define your legacy just as much as any fight ever could. Number 4. Charles Bennett. In a sport full of big personalities, few fighters have ever lived up to a nickname quite like Charles "Crazy Horse" Bennett. From the moment he stepped into the world of MMA, it was clear that he wasn't like anyone else. Fighting in promotions like Pride Fighting Championships, Bennett became known for his explosive style, unpredictable behavior, and raw, almost street fighter energy. He didn't just fight, He created chaos every time he appeared, whether it was inside the ring or far outside of it. Bennett's fighting style perfectly reflected his personality. He was wild, aggressive, and completely unorthodox. He could knock someone out in seconds or lose focus just as quickly. Fans never knew what they were going to get, and that made him incredibly entertaining. At one point, he was even considered one of the most naturally gifted fighters in the lower weight classes, with speed and power that could rival top contenders. But while his talent was undeniable, his lifestyle outside fighting told a very different story. Throughout his career, Bennett became almost as famous for his run-ins with the law as he was for his fights. Arrests, legal issues, and bizarre incidents followed him wherever he went. His chaotic lifestyle made it nearly impossible for him to maintain consistency in training or competition. While other fighters were building structured careers, Bennett was constantly dealing with personal problems that pulled him further away from reaching his full potential. What made things even more unpredictable were the stories that surrounded him. From strange interviews to unbelievable claims and erratic public appearances, Bennett seemed to embrace his crazy horse identity in every aspect of his life. Some moments were funny, others were concerning, but all of them added to the legend of a fighter who refused to fit into any kind of mold. He wasn't polished, disciplined, or media-trained. He was raw and unfiltered in a way that both fascinated and worried fans. There were times when it seemed like Bennett could turn things around. Flashes of brilliance inside the ring reminded everyone of what he was capable of. But those moments were always followed by setbacks, often linked to his behavior outside of competition. The cycle repeated itself over and over again: potential, excitement, chaos, and then consequences. For MMA fans, Charles Bennett represents one of the biggest what-if stories in the sport. What if he had the discipline? What if he had the right support system? Could he have become a champion? It's impossible to say for sure, but one thing is certain: he had the talent to go much further than he did. In the end, Bennett's legacy isn't defined by titles or rankings, but by unpredictability. He remains one of the most chaotic and unforgettable figures in MMA history, a fighter whose life outside the ring was just as wild as anything he ever did inside it. Number 5. Jason Miller. In the world of MMA, personalities often played just as big a role as fighting ability, and few fighters embodied that more than Jason "Mayhem" Miller. From his early days competing in promotions like Strikeforce and later the UFC, Miller stood out not only for his grappling skills, but for his charisma, humor, and unpredictable energy. He wasn't just a fighter, he was an entertainer, someone who could sell fights, create moments, and keep fans watching. At his peak, Miller was a legitimate contender with a well-rounded skill set. He had slick submissions, solid striking, and a fearless approach to competition. But what really made him different was his larger-than-life personality. Whether it was leading the bully beatdown show or jumping into post-fight interviews uninvited, Miller constantly blurred the line between confidence and chaos. At first, it worked in his favor. Fans loved him for being different. But over time, that unpredictability began to take a darker turn. After his fighting career started to slow down, Miller's life outside the cage became increasingly troubled. He began facing a series of legal issues that painted a concerning picture. There were multiple arrests over the years, including charges related to vandalism, trespassing, and resisting arrest. Each new incident seemed more bizarre than the last, making headlines not just in MMA media, but in mainstream news as well. One of the most widely discussed aspects of Miller's story is his apparent struggle with mental health. His behavior became more erratic, with incidents that left fans confused and concerned. Reports described situations where he was found in strange places or acting in ways that suggested he was no longer in control of his actions. These weren't just typical athlete controversies. This was something deeper, something more serious. For fans who had followed his career from the beginning, it was difficult to watch. This was a fighter who once had momentum, recognition, and a real place in the sport. He had the tools to build a long-lasting career, both as a competitor and as a personality in the MMA world. But instead, His story became a series of setbacks, each one pushing him further away from the spotlight he once thrived in. What makes Jason Miller's story so impactful is how quickly things changed. One moment, he was a fan favorite, appearing on TV and fighting on big cards. The next, he was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. It serves as a reminder that the fight game doesn't end when a fighter leaves the cage. Sometimes, the hardest battles happen outside of it. Today, Mayhem Miller is remembered as one of the most unique and unpredictable figures in MMA history. His legacy is a mix of talent, entertainment, and tragedy, a story that highlights both the highs of fame and the consequences of losing control when the spotlight fades. Number 6. Lee Murray. When it comes to the most unbelievable stories in MMA history, Lee Murray stands in a category of his own. Unlike other fighters who had minor legal issues or brief controversies, Murray's story goes far beyond the sport. It crosses into the world of organized crime in a way that almost sounds like a movie. A talented fighter with real potential, Murray once competed in organizations like the UFC, where he showcased his skills and toughness against high-level competition. But his life outside the cage would ultimately define his legacy far more than anything he did inside it. Murray wasn't just a fighter, he was deeply connected to the streets. Known for his intimidating presence and dangerous reputation, he was someone who carried the same intensity from the cage into real life. While many fighters use MMA as a way to escape difficult backgrounds, Murray seemed to remain tied to that world. And eventually, those ties led to one of the most shocking criminal cases ever associated with a professional athlete. In 2006, Murray was linked to what became known as the largest cash robbery in United Kingdom history, the Securitas Depot robbery. The heist targeted a security depot in Kent and resulted in the theft of over £50 million in cash. The scale of the operation was massive, involving detailed planning, coordination, and execution that rivaled something out of a Hollywood script. Authorities later identified Murray as a central figure behind the robbery, describing him as one of the masterminds of the entire operation. What makes this story even more surreal is that Murray allegedly organized the heist while already being involved in criminal networks and maintaining his identity as an MMA fighter. It blurred the line between athlete and criminal in a way rarely seen before. For fans who remembered him as a fighter, the revelations were almost impossible to believe. This wasn't just a bad decision or a moment of poor judgment. This was a large-scale, highly organized crime. After the robbery, Murray fled the United Kingdom and was eventually arrested in Morocco. Due to his dual nationality, he was tried and sentenced there, rather than being extradited back to the UK. In 2010, he received a lengthy prison sentence, effectively ending any chance of returning to professional fighting. His career, which once held promise, was permanently overshadowed by his actions outside the cage. For MMA fans, Lee Murray's story is both fascinating and disturbing. It's not just about wasted potential, it's about a life that took a completely different path, one that led far away from the sport and into something much darker. His case remains one of the most extreme examples of how fighters can become involved in worlds far beyond competition. In the end, Lee Murray isn't remembered for his fights or achievements in MMA. He's remembered for being at the center of one of the most audacious robberies in history, a story so unbelievable that it continues to stand out as one of the wildest chapters the sport has ever seen. Number 7. Thiago Silva. In the unforgiving world of MMA, reputation is built not only on victories, but also on discipline and control. Thiago Silva was once seen as a dangerous force in the light heavyweight division, a fighter with knockout power, aggression, and the kind of intensity that made him a serious threat to anyone standing across from him. Competing in the UFC, Silva quickly gained attention for his explosive performances and fearless style. Inside the octagon, he looked like a future contender. But outside of it, his story would take a much darker turn. Silva's fighting style was built on pressure and power. He pushed forward relentlessly, throwing heavy strikes and overwhelming opponents with physicality. For a time, it worked. He built a solid record and earned respect as one of the more dangerous fighters in his division. But as his career progressed, cracks began to appear, not in his skill, but in his personal life and decision-making outside the sport. Everything changed in 2014, when Silva was involved in a serious and highly publicized incident that shocked the MMA community. He was arrested after allegedly threatening his estranged wife while armed with a firearm. According to reports at the time, the situation escalated into a standoff involving law enforcement, raising immediate concerns about safety and mental stability. For fans and fellow fighters, it was a surreal moment watching a professional athlete known for controlled violence in the cage lose control in real life. The charges against Silva were severe, and the fallout was immediate. He was released from the UFC, and his career took a major hit. Although some of the legal charges were later dropped or reduced, the damage to his reputation had already been done. In a sport where public perception and trust matter, incidents like this can be career-defining, and not in a good way. What makes Thiago Silva's story particularly impactful is how quickly things unraveled. One moment, he was competing on some of the biggest stages in MMA, facing elite competition and building his legacy. The next, he was at the center of a criminal case that overshadowed everything he had accomplished. It's a reminder of how thin the line can be between success and scoot when personal issues go unchecked. Silva would eventually continue fighting in smaller promotions, attempting to rebuild his career and move forward. But for many fans, the memory of that incident remains a defining part of his story. It changed how people viewed him, not just as a fighter, but as a person. In the end, Thiago Silva's journey is one of both promise and последствия. He had the talent to reach the top, but his actions outside the cage altered his path forever. For MMA audiences, his story stands as a powerful example of how quickly everything can change when control is lost, not in a fight, but in real life. Number 8. Junie Browning. In the world of MMA reality TV, few fighters made an impression as quickly and as chaotically as Junie Browning. Introduced to fans through The Ultimate Fighter, Browning instantly stood out, but not just because of his fighting ability. He was loud, unpredictable, emotional, and impossible to ignore. While many fighters used the show as a platform to launch disciplined, focused careers, Browning became known for something entirely different: pure chaos. From the very beginning, his behavior inside the TUF house raised red flags. He clashed with teammates, drank heavily, and often appeared out of control. There were moments where his actions crossed the line from entertaining to concerning, as his emotional instability became more visible with each episode. Yet, despite all of this, Browning had real talent. Inside the cage, he showed flashes of skill, toughness, and creativity that suggested he could have had a legitimate future in the sport. That's what made his story so frustrating for fans. Browning wasn't just another reality TV personality. He was a fighter with potential. But instead of building on that foundation, his life outside the cage began to spiral. Alcohol played a major role in many of his issues, often fueling the erratic behavior that defined his public image. What started as wild moments on a TV show soon turned into real-life consequences. Over the years, Browning faced multiple legal issues, including arrests that further damaged his reputation and stalled any momentum he had left in his career. His name began appearing less in fight announcements and more in reports about troubling incidents. For someone who once had a spotlight on one of MMA's biggest platforms, it was a dramatic fall. What makes Junie Browning's story stand out is how quickly everything unraveled. The same personality that made him memorable on television ultimately worked against him in the long run. In a sport that demands discipline, structure, and mental control, Browning struggled to maintain any of those consistently. Each setback pushed him further away from the opportunities that once seemed within reach. For MMA fans, he represents one of the clearest examples of wasted potential. There are countless fighters who never get the chance he had, to be seen, to be promoted, to fight on a major stage. Browning had all of that, along with the raw ability to back it up. But talent alone wasn't enough to overcome the personal battles he faced. Today, Junie Browning is remembered less for his fights and more for the chaos that surrounded him. His story is a cautionary tale about what can happen when discipline is replaced by instability and when opportunities are overshadowed by poor decisions. In the end, Browning didn't lose his career because he wasn't good enough. He lost it because he couldn't stay in control long enough to realize his full potential. Number 9. Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz is one of the most recognizable and polarizing figures in MMA history. Known for his relentless pace, iron chin, and exceptional Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Diaz built a career that made him both feared and respected inside the octagon. Fighting in promotions like UFC and Strikeforce, he became famous for his exciting fighting style, willingness to stand and strike, and incredible endurance. But while Diaz was a legend in the cage, his life outside of it was often just as intense and controversial. Much of Diaz's notoriety comes from his ongoing issues with athletic commissions and substance regulations. Over the years, he faced multiple suspensions and fines for testing positive for banned substances, particularly marijuana. While many fans debated whether the penalties were fair, these incidents repeatedly interfered with his career. Each suspension meant time away from competition, lost opportunities, and increasing tension with promoters and regulators. Diaz's disputes with the commissions became almost as famous as his fights, as he often spoke openly and bluntly about what he saw as injustice, hypocrisy, or inconsistent rules in the sport. His confrontational personality outside the cage amplified the situation. Diaz was never afraid to speak his mind, challenge authority, or stand up for what he believed, even if it caused conflict. Interviews and press conferences often became heated exchanges, with Diaz calling out officials, fighters, and organizations. While some admired his honesty and fearlessness, others saw it as reckless behavior that put his career in jeopardy. Beyond the regulatory issues, Diaz also had several legal encounters over the years. From minor altercations to incidents involving law enforcement, these episodes contributed to a public perception of him as a fighter who constantly clashed with rules and authority. Even as his reputation as a top-level competitor remained intact, these conflicts outside the octagon created a parallel story of personal struggle and defiance. What makes Nick Diaz's story particularly compelling is this duality. Inside the cage, he is calm, focused, and almost untouchable, a master strategist and relentless pressure fighter. Outside, he is fiery, outspoken, and willing to push boundaries. This contrast is a big part of why fans either love or hate him, but it also illustrates the fine line fighters walk between discipline and rebellion. Despite all the setbacks, Diaz's legacy remains significant. He inspired a generation of fighters to be themselves, to fight their own fights, and to challenge the system when necessary. His story is a reminder that talent alone doesn't shield a fighter from the consequences of personal choices, regulatory battles, or legal troubles. For MMA audiences, Nick Diaz embodies both brilliance and chaos, a fighter whose impact inside the cage is matched only by his turbulent life outside it. Number 10. Phil Baroni. Phil, the New York Badass. Baroni is one of the most notorious names in MMA, not just for his fights, but for the chaos that seems to follow him wherever he goes. Known for his aggressive striking, powerful punches, and willingness to brawl with anyone, Baroni competed in top promotions like UFC, Pride Fighting Championships, and Bellator, earning a reputation as a fearless, exciting fighter. Inside the cage, he was entertaining, tough, and unpredictable. Outside the cage, however, his life took a series of shocking turns that kept fans and the media constantly watching. Baroni's career was marked by incredible highs and dramatic lows. Early on, he was considered one of the most promising light heavyweight and middleweight fighters, scoring memorable knockouts and victories over established competitors. Fans loved his fiery personality, trash-talking, and willingness to put it all on the line. But over time, the fighter who was once admired for his skill and confidence became infamous for his legal troubles and shocking personal choices. One of the most recent and headline-grabbing incidents involved serious criminal allegations that brought his name back into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Reports indicated that Baroni was involved in a case that shocked both MMA fans and the general public, showing a side of the fighter that many had hoped was behind him. His past issues with the law, including prior arrests, combined with these new accusations, painted a portrait of a man whose life outside fighting had become increasingly unstable. What makes Phil Baroni's story particularly compelling and cautionary is the stark contrast between his in-cage talent and his out-of-cage chaos. He could entertain a crowd like few others, deliver stunning knockouts, and show moments of brilliance in strategy and skill. Yet, his personal life repeatedly undermined any momentum or opportunity to cement a lasting legacy in the sport. Fans who followed him closely could see a fighter who had all the tools for greatness, yet kept sabotaging himself with poor decisions and reckless behavior. Baroni's journey serves as a reminder that MMA is not just about fighting skills. It's about discipline, control, and the choices made away from the spotlight. Talent can only carry a fighter so far. Without stability, focus, and responsibility, even the most exciting careers can be derailed. For the MMA community, Baroni remains a symbol of unpredictability, someone who could deliver unforgettable performances and equally unforgettable controversies. In the end, Phil Baroni's story is one of thrills, shock, and lessons learned the hard way. His fights will be remembered for their intensity, but his life outside the cage reminds everyone that even the toughest fighters are vulnerable when personal struggles spiral out of control. He remains one of the most dramatic and talked about figures in recent MMA history.